Executive Suite with WPRI.com reporter Ted Nesi.
This Monday marks the 120th anniversary of Labor Day in Rhode Island. For most people, it's a weekend of fun in the sun before the arrival of autumn. But for workers back in the 1890s, it was a landmark victory. Unions were militant and powerful for much of the 20th century, but labor's numbers have dwindled in recent decades. Yet Rhode Island remains a relative stronghold. Nearly 1 in 5 Rhode Island workers are union members, including 2/3 of all government employees. This week on Executive Suite, taking the pulse of labor today with Rhode Island AFL-CIO President George Nee.
Welcome to Executive Suite. I'm Ted Nesi, and happy Labor Day weekend to everyone, including my guest, George Nee. We see each other at the State House a lot, but here we are in my home base.
Well, thank you very much for having me. Appreciate it on this very historic weekend.
Absolutely. And before we start off, I want to give people, some people may not understand the different organizations we're talking about. You are the president of the AFL-CIO, which isn't exactly a union itself. Explain that.
That's correct. The AFL-CIO, might as well do a little history here, it stands for the American Federation of Labor Congress of Industrial Organizations.
Mouthful.
Which merged in, these two organizations merged in 1955. You're absolutely correct. The AFL-CIO itself is a federation or an umbrella organization of all of the different unions. For example, firefighters, teachers, teamsters, laborers, carpenters, SEIU, UFCW. It's a federation, and so it's a union of unions. Each of the unions themselves are independent, autonomous, and they choose to belong to the AFL-CIO or not. Right now, most of the unions do. There are still several that are outside of the AFL-CIO, although recently the laborers, the United Food and Commercial Workers, Unite Here, have all come back into the AFL-CIO. So we're going in the right direction.
You're getting a unified union, united union movement in Rhode Island.
That's our goal.
So let's start off. We have a chart. I want to look at some of the numbers here. And people have heard probably the stories of the decline of labor nationally, but there's actually some stability when you look at the numbers here in Rhode Island since around 1995. And here it is. You see the red line, that is the percentage. And it actually looks more dramatic than it is because it's really only fluctuated between about 20 and 17, 18% right now. Right. And you see the blue line is the number of workers total, and there's some measurement error and everything. But when you look at that and you think about what you've seen, what's the situation today with labor in Rhode Island in the last decade or so?
We have been relatively stable. I think for two reasons. We've had some organizing activity and some organizing successes, primarily in the healthcare field. We have also had a very strong public sector organization going back to the 60s. So we're, as I think what the intro said, we're about 2/3 of our membership are public sector workers, and that would include federal workers also, federal, municipal, teachers, state, firefighters, et cetera. So we've been relatively stable. We've had some organizing activities that have offset the manufacturing losses. I mean, I started in the labor movement in Rhode Island when probably the 2 or 3 largest unions were the steel workers, the machinists, and the electrical workers.
A different economy in a way then.
It's just a completely different economy between globalization and the other thing that's happening, and even with the coming back of some of the manufacturing sector, huge changes in technology. So even though you might have some plants where they've been unionized for a long time, they may be producing as much, if not more product, but with far less workers because of the technology, which is, happened all through history and will continue to happen. So,
and that's something we see in the data where Rhode Island's manufacturing output's stayed about the same, but the percentage, the number of people working to make that has gone way down.
Oh yeah, and even we still have a jewelry industry, which people forget, but it's a high-end jewelry industry. It isn't the costume jewelry the way it used to be. So it requires both a real skilled workforce, and it also requires changes in the technology to make that happen.
You mentioned organizing. When people think, I mentioned at the top Labor Day and the history of unions in America, people think of the sit-down strikes at GM in the 30s and the big fights that sort of created the modern union movement. How important is organizing today to labor in Rhode Island? I know it's difficult with some of the legal changes that have taken place.
It's absolutely critical. It's not unlike it is in a business. Unless you grow, you will eventually fade away. So unions today are spending much more of their resources and focus on organizing because they know that from membership comes political and legislative strength. You know, there is a direct correlation both around the world and in the United States of America between what we call the density, or the percentage of the state that is organized, the percentage of a country that's organizing, and the standard of living for everybody. So when the labor movement decreases and has less power, it affects all workers. It affects whether or not what the minimum wage is going to be in that state, what the unemployment insurance benefits are going to be, what the workers' comp benefits are going to be, because we are the voice not just for the union members, we become the voice for all workers, because oftentimes, because of fear, because of the laws not, in our opinion, really favorable towards workers, it's very difficult to organize. People try to organize all the time. I started off as an organizer. I was involved in 50, 60 union elections. And I know what the chilling effect is when they just go out and fire one worker. And if you can't get that worker back in a reasonable time frame with back pay, it has a chilling effect on the whole organizing drive. And employers know this. And there's an art form to this. There's a cottage industry of how to stop the labor movement. Every year in America, 10,000 workers are fired.
On organizing, obviously the big discussion right now is about this move to unionize about 600 child care workers. There was a law passed. Governor Carcieri famously opposed it, not always someone you got along with.
Very rarely.
He said it would be an unmitigated legal and financial disaster. Obviously the child care workers who are supportive of this say it will give them better benefits and give them a voice. What's your case for unionizing them? It's getting a lot of bad publicity.
Well, here's the situation. You have to go back to what is the fundamental reason why people form unions. It's to gain a voice on the job. It's to gain some control over their wages, their benefits, and their working conditions. So if you look at it from that lens, you have a group of people, 600 or so, that are providing a very important service. They are providing child care so that people that need that child care can get into the workforce and stay in the workforce. All they're really doing is, again, through a democratic process, through an election, secret ballot election, they are going to decide themselves. They haven't made that decision yet. They've petitioned for an election. They will have a vote whether or not they want to form an organization, a union, to improve their wages, their benefits, their working conditions. If you really look at the law, it does preclude them from a number of issues that normally would be involved in a union setting, in that they can't directly affect their wages with the employer, which is in this case the state of Rhode Island, because that's a budgetary issue. So they and the state could go to the General Assembly and say, we'd like an increase in the child care reimbursement rate. Ultimately, that decision would be made by the General Assembly.
But aren't they, I mean, one of the points people who don't like this idea make is that these are really small, independent businesses as opposed to individual workers who are part of a group the way you think of the traditional unions. What do you say to that?
Well, there's no question it's a hybrid situation. It isn't fall into what your traditional situation is. And in fact, the legislation specifically says that they're not state employees for the purposes of health care benefits and or pension benefits. But the workforce in America is evolving. I mean, in some ways positively and in some ways negatively, in that the relationships are changing. And that moves us or get into another issue of what's happening in our economy related to independent contractors and the misclassification of workers. So these groups of people out there that I guess someone could say traditionally had not been part of the labor movement. We are looking to evolve. We're looking to change. We understand what's happening in the economy. So these are the kind of, you're going to see more and more of this type of situation as time goes on.
All right, we have to take a break. When we come back, we're going to talk much more with George Nee, president of the AFL-CIO, about the future of organized labor in Rhode Island. Stick with us. You're watching Executive Suite. too. You know how to talk.
We know how to do this.
Executive Suite. I'm Ted Beasy. For Labor Day, we have the president of the AFL-CIO of Rhode Island, George Nee. And George, we were talking before about policy and the State House, and you know, we hear so much, the Providence Journal editorial page in particular, other places, about labor's influence at the State House, that unions run the State House. I know most union people I tell you don't think you run the State House, but where do you see how influential is labor up there with the governor, with the Senate president, with the House Speaker?
Well, I'd like to say two things. One is that we make every effort we can to be as influential as we can, because we feel that's our responsibility. We believe that working people should have a voice in every decision that's made in the state of Rhode Island, whether it's executive branch, the legislative branch, the department heads, the quasi-publics, whatever. We believe we should have a voice and seat at the table. I would argue that we become a convenient scapegoat for the people who feel that you have to blame somebody for what's going on. I wish we had the power that people think we do. Do we have power? Yeah, I hope we do. Do we seek to get more? Yes, we do. But if you look at over the last several years, because of the nature of both the national economy and the local economy, we haven't been doing that well. I mean, if we had all the power we did, we would have never had the pension reform effort that went through. It's been very difficult to get a lot of legislation through in recent years. We've been making some progress the last couple of years. So, you know, thank God we're around so that we have some people have people to blame. I wish the people who are complaining all the time would just pay attention to the democracy that we live in, and instead of blaming us and complaining about us, just go out and participate. There's not the law's the same for everybody. We abide by every single law, and we take pride in participating in the democratic process. That's a right that we have in this country, and we're proud of it. And they tried to deny us for many, many years. You know, I mean, remember, this country comes from a time when working people didn't have the right to vote. You had to own property. You know, you had to be a person of standing in the community. So we've fought all these years, going back to all the people that came before us, and we're going to keep fighting.
You had some real successes that I noticed during this past session, particularly getting the minimum wage higher.
Yep.
I know that's something close to your heart.
Yep.
I want to ask you about two bills that it always drives the Chamber of Commerce crazy when you guys tangle up there. First one, that bill to make Victory Day a floating holiday. Rhode Island, the only place that still has a legal holiday on Victory Day. This would have allowed it to be given at different times a year. You told me the first day that was introduced, you opposed it. Why oppose that?
Ridiculous.
Why?
Because, first of all, it's being wrapped up as if it has something to do with economic development. We wouldn't be here today if we didn't have Victory Day. Our people, working people, people from all over the country, fought to stop fascism, and we won. Why shouldn't we celebrate a day where it reminds us of the freedom and the sacrifices that we have?
But it wasn't to take away Victory Day, it was just to give it on a different part of the year.
Well, you know, this tragedy is when it first happened, there were 25 or 30 states that had it, and then eventually they all got rid of it. Now, Massachusetts has Patriots Day and Bunker Hill Day. Tennessee has Sadie Hawkins Day. Everybody has, you know, we should be proud of this. So we're going to fight to the death to keep it. We are working with the veterans groups all the time, and it'll never happen as long as I'm around, I hope.
I have no doubt you'll be fighting on that one. I want to actually turn, you mentioned Massachusetts and other places. I want to turn to your own biography a little bit, and we actually have some photos. When you got involved with the labor movement as a student at Boston College, you actually became very close to Cesar Chavez, the very famous organizer of the farm workers. Tell me about how you got into this and how you came to know him. There you are together there.
Well, I would say that Cesar is probably my most important mentor. I quit college back in 1970 to go work full-time for the United Farm Workers of America for $5 a week plus room and board. I became a UFCW at that time, I mean not UFW, volunteer. Participated in the Great Boycott in both Massachusetts and they sent me to, actually they're the ones that sent me to Rhode Island to run the lettuce boycott in 1971. After that, I went to California and I was actually a security guard for Cesar.
A bodyguard, yeah.
Well, bodyguard, security guard, probably a bodyguard. In 1975 when Jerry Brown, believe it or not, who's the governor today,
Right.
1975 signed the first law in the country giving farm workers, agricultural workers, the right to organize. So we did a long march. We did organizing in the fields. We signed up workers on at rallies and in the fields. And then I came back to Rhode Island in 1976 and started my own union. But it was from that experience of evolving from a community organization, which I was involved in organizing unemployed people, to becoming a union, and I really credit Caesar for the guidance and inspiration to make that transition.
And you've been a force in the union movement here for, as you say, many years. You succeeded Frank Monorano as president in 2009, so you've actually been president for 4 years now.
Just 4 years. This is I'm up for re-election this term.
Oh, all right. Well, so it's a political show today. Too. When I was looking at the clippings from then, one of the things you said, according to the Journal, quote, "I think we need to do a much better job improving the public image of labor." Do you think you've accomplished that?
It's a struggle. I think we've made some efforts. We run a show through our Institute for Labor Studies and Research called Labor Vision, which we put on regular activities of what's happening in the labor movement, both the present and the history. It's expensive. I mean, we have a lot of forces that put out negative information about the labor movement or no information about the labor movement. One of the areas that I think we started and we haven't done as good a job is labor information about the labor movement in the school system, so that people have a sense of where this all came from. But no, it's tough. It's an area that I think it's unfinished business.
And we're up against the break, but quickly, how long do you see yourself staying in the job?
Well, as long as I still have the fire in my belly and I have my health. Right now, I got both.
All right. We'll talk more, maybe a little bit more about politics with George Nee when we come back. Stick with us on Executive Suite. Welcome back to Executive Suite. I'm Ted Nisi, and I'm joined for Labor Day by Rhode Island AFL-CIO President George Nee. George, got to ask you a little bit about politics. As I mentioned, we both spent a lot of time at the State House. I want to start actually with the big pension law that you mentioned it earlier that passed in 11. Obviously, fiercely opposed by a lot of public sector labor, basically everybody. There are these private court-ordered negotiations going on now about resolving it. Are you involved in that at all?
No. The AFL-CIO itself is not a party to the lawsuit, so we are not party to the mediations, court-ordered mediation that's going on.
One thing people wonder is they saw those numbers, and I know even that was controversial, the numbers at the time of the pension fight, but a lot of people said maybe there's a different way, but it really doesn't seem like Rhode Island has the money to pay every dollar promised over time. Could the union movement in Rhode Island ever agree to some restructuring of the benefits promised?
I think at this stage of the game, it'd be better to say no comment to that.
All right, we'll move on. I'm not going to
even though I'm not a part of it, I don't want to,
I figured, but I have to try.
That's
my job.
That's your job.
Then let's talk about 2014.
Yes.
The AFL-CIO was neutral in the 2010 governor's race, not the individual unions, but the umbrella, the union of unions was neutral between the candidates.
That's accurate.
Do you think that'll happen again next year? Do you think the AFL-CIO will endorse a Democratic candidate?
Well, right now you have a very, very fluid situation, as you can imagine. I mean, we could be looking at a three-way Republican primary, three-way Democratic primary. Probably it's important to understand how we operate. Our affiliates, the independent unions that are part of the FSO, they make that decision. But we have a very unique rule. In order to get an endorsement from the AFL-CIO, you need 2/3
of all the member unions.
All of the members that are participating. So that's why what happened in 2010 is it was split maybe 55, 45, 50, it was pretty close. And the thinking behind that is that the labor movement itself is more important than any one politician. So we don't want to have a fractured movement or a divisive movement if we can avoid it as much as possible. So right now we are maintaining relationships with any and all candidates who want to have relationships with us. We have our issues and our agendas, and we put them forward. And as time goes on, we'll take a look at them and see who we believe has been in the best, has treated us best. The
three Democrats, we have Lincoln Chafee, now Democrat, Angel Taveras, Gina Raimondo, all clearly looking at this race very closely. Do you think all three of them could make a play for the labor vote, even Gina Raimondo after the pension fight?
I think she has would have a very, very difficult time.
An uphill battle for her.
Yeah, to be fair. I mean, unless something dramatic changes. challenges. But given where we are right now, honestly, that's a pretty uphill battle.
What about Governor Chafee? I mean, Labor was very important to getting him elected in 2010. He signed that pension law. I mean, what's the feeling in Labor about Chafee now?
Well, actually, on the part of some of the unions, there was as much, if not more, disappointed with Governor Chafee than there even was with Gina Raimondo.
Really?
Because she never made any commitments. She never made any statements saying, I would never. She said, look, I'll take a look and I'll have to see, Governor Chafee actually made commitments to several of the unions that he would not change the pension for the existing workforce. And they feel, a lot of the rank and file members, particularly the teachers union, felt somewhat betrayed by that activity.
Are people still angry?
Oh, well, let me tell you, this year the retirees didn't get their COLA. Every time people go to work, again, our people have always paid. They paid every 2 weeks. No one has ever said that the labor movement people, working people, never kept their commitments. We did. Other people made decisions that came back.
Let me ask you that, though.
Yes.
I mean, I've looked back. There were times where labor leaders allowed the politicians, Democratic leadership at the State House, to not put as much into the pension fund as they might have some years. You saw it in 1990 with Speaker DeAngelis. I mean, do labor leaders, did they not push hard enough to get those funded?
I don't think it's fair to say allowed it, because that would infer that we were part of an agreement.
Didn't fight it then, I'd say.
It was fought. The statements were made, but they were budget decisions that when Speaker DeAngelis, that was when Governor Sondland was and also happened under Governor Dupree and Governor Sondland. They made bad decisions looking back on it, because when you don't do that, look at other decisions were made when benefits were provided or increased and no one ever did an actuarial statement.
Right,
that was
no
wrong.
funding.
So, it's like we're on deck now when all of these things are coming to roost.
One other question for you: when you look at how labor has operated in Rhode Island, obviously we're struggling economically, and as you said, you can't blame everything on labor by any stretch of the imagination. But do you think labor leaders bear any part of the blame for where Rhode Island has ended up with such high unemployment and other things, or do you think most of the time labor was on the side of the Angels and other people made the bad decisions?
Well, I think, to be fair, if the government of the United States of America and the government of Rhode Island adopted labor's agenda, I think would be better off in both cases. And what I mean by that is investments in our infrastructure, investments in our people, increasing the minimum wage, changing the balance, the inequities that exist in our economic system. I think these fast food strikes and activities that are going on are a microcosm of that. This is nonsense to say that these people couldn't make $15 an hour. It would cost...
Just 15 seconds left.
It would cost them a few bucks, or the corporate people taking less, the profits being less, and maybe the price of a hamburger going a little bit, and that would be economic justice. So labor's agenda, the people's lobby is the way to go.
All right, well, we'll let George Nee finish for Labor Day with his stump speech. I want to thank George for being here, president of the AFL-CIO. If you missed any of this show or any other episode of Executive Suite, you can catch those on our newly redesigned WPRI.com. I'm Ted Nisi. See you next week on Executive Suite. Thanks, George. Thanks for coming in.
No, my pleasure.